Before 1940, the Jewish people were largely dispersed around the world, with Europe becoming their primary place of settlement. However, during World War II, the Jewish people suffered immense devastation under Hitler's rule. Their lives, property, and dignity were ruthlessly trampled. In this situation, during Hitler's rule, the Jewish people began striving to establish their own nation in order to live a peaceful life and create a secure future for their descendants. Millions of Jews were brutally killed. The Jews of Europe, especially those in Germany, turned their eyes to a small region along the Mediterranean coast called Palestine. Jews from Africa, Europe, and other parts of the world began migrating to Palestine, longing to have their own land, to live alongside their fellow people, and to establish a nation of their own, so that their destiny would no longer be controlled by Europeans. But the question is, why did Jews from all over the world choose this particular small piece of land? To understand the history of the Jewish people in Israel, we must turn the pages of history. The story begins roughly 4,000 years ago in the region of Mesopotamian civilization where idol worship was widespread. At that time, there were no specific religions, and society had yet to fully develop or mature. It was during this period that Abraham was born. He initiated a new form of faith, and his descendants would go on to give rise to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Abraham gradually migrated to the land of Canaan, which is present-day Israel and Palestine. He began teaching religious doctrines to the people, establishing a faith whose followers came to be known as the Jewish people. Abraham had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. In their time, many people also followed the Jewish faith, and its number of followers was considerable. Later, Isaac's son Jacob, who is well known in Christianity, further developed Judaism. After Jacob married, he had 12 sons who founded 12 different tribes. These tribes began to govern, and under one son, Judah, Judaism was formally established for the first time. But as time passed, this region fell into a dark period. The Jewish people gradually began migrating to neighboring countries, with most heading to Egypt. Wherever they went, Jews established settlements and lived in close-knit communities, which helped them achieve notable success in commerce. This caused fear in the Egyptian pharaoh. The pharaoh feared that if the Jewish population continued to grow, one day they might take over Egypt and rule the land due to their increasing numbers and prosperity. This made the pharaoh uneasy. Soon, to curb the influence and growth of the Jewish community, the pharaoh issued a shocking decree. The Egyptian king ordered the killing of all Jewish males and boys and the enslavement of Jewish women. This not only caused a sharp decline in the Jewish population, but also forced many Jews to flee to other countries. It was during this time that a Jewish family in Egypt welcomed the birth of Moses. Moses endured many hardships, gathered the Jews living in Egypt, and led them through numerous challenges back to Israel. Afterward, Moses was regarded as a religious leader, gaining increasing respect among the Jewish people. When all the Jews returned together from Egypt to Israel, he delivered God's 10 commandments, the 10 laws, which Jews believe following them leads to a happy and prosperous life. Moses inscribed the 10 commandments on stone tablets. The stone tablets were placed in a sacred center among the Jewish people and are known as God's 10 Commandments. Thus, after a long struggle, the Jewish people finally had a permanent homeland. After some time, Solomon established the Kingdom of Israel, making it a kingdom of the Jewish people themselves. Around 1000 BCE, King David, the father of King Solomon, became the first strong monarch of the Jewish people. His son, Solomon, known as Suleiman in Islamic tradition, succeeded him. He is famously known as Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. He built the first temple in Jerusalem, which became a central place of worship for the Jewish people. This temple is known as the First Temple or Solomon's Temple. Because the Jewish people do not worship idols, they place the stone tablets inscribed with Moses' 10 Commandments inside this temple. However, it wasn't long before civil war broke out, dividing the people into two factions. During King Solomon's reign, the Jews held great power and influence. Wealth also accumulated significantly during this time. However, just 2 generations later, a king from Mesopotamia named Shalmaneser launched an attack, resulting in the deaths of thousands of Jews and a severe sacking of Jerusalem. Although the Jewish people managed to rebuild their nation and kingdom, a major event occurred in 587 BCE when, amid frequent wars, Jerusalem was completely destroyed. At that time, under the orders of the Babylonian king, the entire Jewish community was plundered. They suffered a terrible disaster, and the survivors were taken captive by the Babylonians and enslaved. The Babylonian kingdom destroyed the Jewish kingdom. Afterward, the Jewish people were under Babylonian rule, and the Babylonians also destroyed their first temple. During this period, thousands of Jews were exiled for 70 years, and many fled Israel, dispersing across the world. After this catastrophe, Jerusalem and Israel almost vanished from Jewish history. Shortly afterward, a new empire arose in Iran, the Persian Empire. The Persian king conquered many regions along the Mediterranean coast, including Babylon and Egypt, establishing the vast Persian Empire. Within this empire, the Jewish people were granted certain freedoms. The Persian king issued a decree allowing those Jews who had been enslaved and exiled to Babylon to return to Israel and rebuild their homeland. The Persian king also permitted the Jews to rebuild the temple once again. The Jewish people returned to Israel and rebuilt the temple on its original site. This temple was called the Second Temple. The Jewish people began to rebuild their lives here, but the land remained deeply troubled by ongoing wars and conflicts. After some time, Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire, including Jerusalem, bringing the region under his rule. Following the fall of Alexander's empire, until around 63 BCE, Israel became part of the Roman Empire during the Roman period. Jesus Christ was born into a Jewish family. He gradually gained great popularity among the people and claimed to be the Son of God. Soon, his followers began spreading his teachings within Jewish society. People were deeply moved by his teachings and came to witness his miracles. However, this caused displeasure among the Jewish religious leaders who began spreading opposition against Jesus, refusing to acknowledge him as God's messenger and rejecting his teachings around 30 to 33 CE. Jesus was crucified because his teachings were seen as violating religious laws. However, Jesus' crucifixion led to a growing number of his followers throughout the Roman Empire, and many Jews began to embrace Christianity, which made the situation for the Jewish community increasingly difficult. As the Christian population continued to grow, Jewish religious leaders united in rebellion against the Roman Empire. This conflict became known as the First Jewish-Roman War. They tried to expel the Christians from Israel and free themselves from Roman rule during the Roman War. People formed groups and began to resist the rule of the Roman Empire. When the Jews first spoke out for their rights and refused to recognize the rule of the Roman Empire, the Romans besieged the entire city of Jerusalem, cutting off the food supply, which caused many Jews to starve to death. Afterwards, the Romans began massacring many Jews and eventually leveled the entire city of Jerusalem to the ground. During this period, the Romans also destroyed the Jewish Second Temple, and many Jewish families were tragically killed. Those who survived were either forced to convert to other religions or became slaves. Jewish women suffered severe atrocities, and Jewish men and children were also brutally killed. The Romans not only killed millions of Jews, but also enslaved a large number of them and imposed heavy taxes on the surviving Jewish population. To erase the traces of Israel, the Romans changed the name of Jerusalem. David Ilia Capitolina also renamed a small region of Israel called Julia to Syria. The name Palestina later evolved into Palestine. Gradually, in this area later called Palestine, the followers of Jesus began to spread Christianity. Although the rulers of the Roman Empire at the time opposed Christianity, people still secretly practiced the religion. At first, Christianity did not spread widely. The Roman Empire still existed in 324 AD, but soon after, the Roman Empire split. In 324 AD, the Byzantine Empire, which was part of the Roman Empire, took control of Jerusalem and the rights of the Roman Empire there. It fell into the hands of Constantine, who was known as the Great Emperor. Constantine embraced Christianity and the teachings of Jesus. As a result, he built a church in Jerusalem at the site of Jesus' tomb and officially recognized Christianity. This church was named the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Afterwards, the Byzantine Empire declared Christianity as its official religion. Because the Jews did not accept Jesus' teachings and were seen as supporting his crucifixion, they once again became targets of attack by this new empire. A new wave of persecution began. During this period, thousands of Jews converted to Christianity, while those who refused to convert faced persecution once again. The Byzantine Empire knew very well that if the Jews were given even a small chance, they would immediately establish their own kingdom. Therefore, during this period, the Byzantine Empire enacted many laws to weaken the rights of the Jewish people. According to certain rules, Jews were not allowed to own slaves or servants, and marriages between Jews and non-Jews were prohibited. They were not allowed to establish any community centers, nor were they permitted to gather in large groups for prayer. For Jews who did not comply with these rules, corresponding punishments were enforced, including the confiscation of their property. In many cases, they were either imprisoned or directly sentenced to death. The Jewish people endured several centuries of hardship under these difficult conditions. In 638 AD, the Arab army, led by Omar, conquered Jerusalem. Subsequently, the entire regions of Syria and Palestine came under Arab rule. During the Arab rule, they officially established the name of the region as Palestine. From 638 AD to 1099 AD, Palestine was under Islamic rule. During this period, Jews were granted certain freedoms. Many converted to Islam and claimed descent from Abraham. During this period, the Jewish community flourished greatly. The Muslim caliphs invited Jews from all over the world to return to Jerusalem. During this period, many Jews from the surrounding regions once again migrated to Israel. Although many Jews had settled in Africa, Europe, especially around Spain, Germany, and Russia, and established small communities there over the past 500 years, with the spread of Islam, Jews also dispersed across the world. Until 1099, the lives of Jews were relatively stable. But by the 11th century, Europeans began exploring sea routes and conquered nearly all regions. Palestine was no exception. Europeans started massacring the local people there. Additionally, in other parts of Europe where Jewish communities lived, persecution of Jews also began. In fact, almost all European countries began to embrace Christianity, believing that the Jews were responsible for crucifying Jesus. Even after 1,000 years, they thought the Jews should pay the price for this. European Christians not only occupied Palestine and Jerusalem, but also caused troubles in the lives of the local Jewish communities. They believed that Jerusalem, where Jesus' tomb was located, should be taken back from the Muslims, and that the Jews, who were considered responsible for Jesus' death, should be eliminated. This conflict began in 1095 and lasted until 1291. During this period, terrible wars broke out between Muslims and Christians, known as the Crusades. In fact, both Jews and Muslims regard Jerusalem as their holy city, while Christians also consider this land sacred and seek to establish their own rule there. In this war, Muslims and Jews united to fight against the Christians, hoping to drive the Christians out of Jerusalem. In the war, millions of people on both sides lost their lives, with the suffering of the Jews living in the region being especially severe. After the war ended, European Christians began persecuting Jews in various places. They would torment the Jews whenever they saw them. This way of life and suffering continued until the rise of the Ottoman Empire. In the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire conquered Jerusalem and ruled over much of Europe. Under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, the Jewish people gained a certain degree of freedom. Although their lives were not easy, compared to the persecution they faced from Christians in Europe, life under Ottoman rule was somewhat better. The Ottoman Empire not only restored the religious freedom of the Jewish people, it also gave them the opportunity to live better lives. The Ottoman Empire attempted to resolve the complex holy site disputes in Jerusalem. They arranged for the entrances of the Temple Mount walls, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and churches in the area known as Palestine to be open to all people in order to prevent religious conflicts. The Ottoman Empire's initiative played an important role in Jerusalem. For a long period, there were no religious wars among the three major religions, but the suffering of the Jewish people did not end. Over the past 2,000 years, due to continuous exile, most Jewish people settled along the Mediterranean coast and in Europe. But in Europe, anti-Semitism began to rise, and Christians started to persecute Jews without cause. This hatred toward Jews is called anti-Semitism, which means discrimination against Jewish people based on their religion and ethnicity. This discrimination was not ordinary. Anti-Semites viewed Jewish people as societal outcasts, excluding them from community and social welfare systems. Jewish people were often accused of breaking religious laws and practicing witchcraft, and some were even burned alive. In the 18th century, anti-Semitism spread throughout Europe, leaving Jews struggling on the brink of life and death, enduring daily beatings, enslavement, and massacres. Anti-Semites, especially Christians, began large-scale persecutions of Jews. They gathered men, women, the elderly, and even pregnant women together and burned thousands of Jews alive. Many were expelled from France and other parts of Europe. Jews were forced to wear yellow badges so that others could easily identify them. Specific religious activities and marriage, among other things, are prohibited for Jews. Those Jews who converted to Christianity were also not treated well in Europe. In short, due to anti-Semitism, Jews throughout Europe suffered brutal persecution. Over time, the situation did not improve. Life became increasingly difficult for them. They were subjected to specific punishments, and even a small mistake could lead to a beating. Every few years, wars would break out with the aim of expelling them from the country. Christians believed that Jews only cared about their own interests and their own community, and therefore should not be entitled to the rights of normal social life. Under such circumstances, millions of Jews were forced to flee to the United States. During the same period, the French Revolution broke out in the 18th century. Under Napoleon's rule, Jews were given the opportunity to live a better life. However, with the end of the Napoleonic era, that opportunity faded. The good times in the lives of the Jews also came to an end. However, this repeated persecution became unbearable for the descendants of the Jewish people. Gradually, the Jewish people began to demand a land of their own. Their appeals were mainly directed at European countries, as in modern society, Jews were homeless and forced to flee from place to place. Because of the suffering they endured around the world, the entire Jewish community realized that if they wanted to live in peace, they had to establish their own country. By the 19th century, discussions about the Jewish people establishing their own country began to emerge. In 1860, Theodor Herzl was born in Hungary. He personally experienced numerous anti-Semitic policies and the hatred of Europeans. He initiated a movement called Zionism, which advocated for the Jewish people to establish their own country. During this period, he wrote a book titled U-Thai, which sounds like Thailand. In this book, he called on Jews around the world for the first time to establish their own country. Herzl was a lawyer. In the 19th century, he was the first to advocate for the Jewish people and their own nation. His vision for a Jewish state influenced Jews around the world. Shortly afterward, a Jewish political committee was established, called the Zionist Organization. The organization's first meeting was held in Switzerland in 1897. After this meeting, Jews from around the world began donating to the organization to support the Zionist movement. Soon, the organization raised a large amount of funds to establish a Jewish state of their own. At that time, all of Europe echoed with the slogan that the land from the Rhine River to the Jordan River and Israel belonged to the Jews, which filled Jewish families with fear. In this context, Herzl called on Jews around the world to return to their ancestral homeland, Israel, which at that time had become Palestine. In response to his call, many Jews began moving to Israel. Herzl believed that driving anti-Semitism out of Europe was impossible, and therefore Jews would forever live a tragic life. So he intensified his calls to establish a Jewish state. In response to his call, Jews once again began migrating to Israel. As soon as conditions allowed, they moved toward Palestine. Some even trekked across deserts on foot to reach Palestine, enduring persecution fueled by anti-Semitism. At that time, Palestine was under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, so the arrival of the Jews was not met with much resistance. The event of Jews fleeing from Europe to Palestine. This migration of Jews from Europe to Palestine is called the Aliyah. The first Aliyah took place between 1882 and 1903, during which about 35,000 Jews returned to Israel. The second Aliyah occurred between 1904 and 1914, with approximately 40,000 more Jews returning to Israel. During this period, World War I broke out, yet about 40,000 Jews still migrated to Palestine. Despite arriving in Palestine, the Jews' lives there were far from stable. They lived much like refugees. However, what comes next? The Jews possessed a certain amount of wealth, and they hoped to use these resources to build their own cities, schools, and hospitals, to nurture their culture, and to establish their own nation at any cost. And the British were well aware of this. At that time, Jews in the United States were very wealthy, and they had been continuously funding the Zionist organization. After the United States entered the war, Jews began to support Britain to some extent. Britain took advantage of this by seeking financial aid from the Jewish community around 1917 to help boost its declining economy. In exchange for funding the war expenses, Britain promised that if the Jewish community provided financial support and Britain won World War I, it would help the Jews establish their own nation. The Jewish people in Israel believed Britain's promise and offered their support. This commitment, made between the British government and Jewish leaders, is known as the Balfour Declaration. Based on this promise, the Jews provided economic support to Britain during the war to help Britain in its fight. The Ottoman Empire. In the end, the Ottoman Empire was defeated, and Palestine came under British control. With Palestine occupied by the British, Jews from all over the world began migrating there in large numbers. Jewish leaders saw that people were coming from different places, speaking different languages, and living in diverse ways. To foster greater unity within the Jewish community, they established a city and named it Tel Aviv. There, Jewish leaders worked hard to revive Hebrew, the ancient language of the Jewish people. They established schools to teach Hebrew. They promoted the use of Hebrew in newspapers, public announcements, and prayer ceremonies, which strengthened the bonds within the Jewish community. As the Jewish population grew under British rule, the local Palestinians, who were mainly Muslims, began to feel fearful. This marked the beginning of the struggle for control between Israelis and Palestinians. Both sides claimed sovereignty over Palestine, leaving the British in a difficult position trying to manage the issue. They didn't know which side to favor. The situation soon sparked resistance from the Palestinians against both the Jews and the British forces. Listen to favor. To calm the situation, Britain limited immigration to Palestine to 10,000 people per year. However, due to escalating anti-Semitism in Poland, Russia, and Germany, millions of Jews illegally entered Palestine despite these restrictions. During this period, the Jews established agricultural lands in their cities and began engaging in farming. In addition, they also founded. After establishing the labor organization called Haganah, they went on to create an elected council known as the National Committee, as well as Israel's defense forces. To some extent, through the Haganah, they began gradually establishing their own state. At the same time, Hitler rose to power in Germany and launched brutal persecution against the Jews. Millions of Jews were forced to flee back to their homeland, Israel. As the Jewish population increased, the conflict in the Palestinian region became more intense. However, this time, the Jews had no intention of fleeing. They formed their own armed forces and even achieved victories in the civil war against the Palestinians. Between 1933 and 1938, several civil wars broke out in Palestine, with many Jews and Muslims losing their lives in the conflict. During this period, the Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, who was the head of the Supreme Muslim Council at the time, believed that cooperation with Hitler was necessary to drive the Jews out of Palestine. He went to Germany, hoping to align with Hitler, believing that this would not only allow him to form a Muslim army, but also help in expelling the Jews from Palestine. He also hoped to implement the same methods of persecution against the Jews in Palestine as those used by Germany. However, Hitler never truly took the Mufti seriously. Instead, his close ally, Adolf Eichmann, became the key figure in dealing with the Mufti's plans and maintaining their alliance. During World War II, Britain completely sealed off Palestine's borders, preventing Jews from entering. Other countries also closed their doors to Jewish refugees. In 1939, with the outbreak of the war, about 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust. Those who managed to survive, after enduring unimaginable suffering, struggled to reach Israel. Having experienced the horrific torment of the Holocaust, the Jews could no longer bear their plight. They began to exert pressure on Britain once again, demanding the establishment of their own state. This time, the Jews did not back down. They took up arms, determined to make Israel an independent state. Israel's armed forces began forcibly bringing back the Jews who had survived the Holocaust and fled, welcoming them into the country. During this period, many small-scale conflicts occurred, with both Jews and the British suffering casualties. However, in the end, the Jews won this struggle. By 1947, the Zionist movement had become incredibly strong among the Jewish people. After World War II, Britain's economy suffered a significant decline. As a result, Britain issued a white paper, declaring that it would withdraw from Palestine in May 1948. However, up until this point, Britain's earlier promise to establish a homeland for the Jews